Hello and welcome to Scrapbooking Station. This video is all about Christmas. We're going to work on Christmas clusters. So whether you've got a punch and you want to make it feel comfortable on your card, or you've just got a couple die cuts, or you've got an image, we're even going to work with some mixed media pieces. So whatever's in your stash, I think this design is going to work for you. I'm going to put the camera over my shoulder and we'll get started. To begin, I'm going to be working with trees, and so I also, for this first piece, what I want to start with is a real busy panel. So I've got one panel here that's going to situate on top of my card. And to make my trees, or my cluster, feel at home, well, first off, the meat of my cluster is going to be a punch. So I've got this really basic kind of Christmas tree shape that's going to situate on top of, in this case, a 5 by 6.5 inch card. So I've already got this all figured out. I'm going to punch out my trees, and when I do that, I'm going to punch out of these matten layers. So I'm going to punch this out, but I'm also going to make use of punching into this, because what I want to do is build some layer with the basic elements. So let me get that basic piece situated on my card front, and then I'll be back. This is as far as I've taken this card, and it would be really pretty if maybe I just added a bow, but it really wouldn't be a cluster. I consider a cluster to be 7 or more, and it just kind of depends the size of these main elements. And so I'm thinking this card needs some sequinizing. So I am going to add some coordinating sequins in these olive greens. So I've got a couple bags here of a darker green and lighter olive green, and maybe some silvers, and attach those, and you're going to see how that turns out. Of course, I'm going to finish the inside in envelopes as well. So I'm going to do that. I want to do another tree project, and so this time I'm going to use a cutting die. So I've got this one here, and just making sure you can see that on camera. This time I'm doing long card, standard book fold, but it's going to be portrait size. So tall and portrait. I'm creating a scene in the back just using white. So this is primarily going to be a monochrome card. Maybe add some craft bits. So I'm going to show you the setup for that. And then the last Christmas tree piece, what I'm going to do is take this topper and divide it up. And so I am going to actually make a cluster out of this image using some rectangle cutting dies. And so I'm going to be using these from Tonic, and so probably these smaller pieces. First off, figuring out which ones I want high, and then which ones I want down into the card base. Now for that backdrop, I'm going to go with a pretty standard across. So I got 2 pieces of cardstock. This is permanently black and red, and so I see a lot of my embellishments coming in red. And again, I'll leave you the setups for that. So let me put some of that together, and I'll be back. So in finishing up this first project, so I decided just the olive green sequins, so just kind of spreading them across the 3 Christmas trees. And then I've got this rather chunky ribbon. I am going to finish up the inside, and so I used the tree that popped out of here, and then another silver tree to kind of create this interior. I didn't talk about the materials much, so this punch comes from Stampin' Up, but then the focal, or the mat, for the primary mats for the inside and the outside, actually comes from a base card that is A5 in size, which I very rarely use. I make hundreds of cards, and maybe 3 or 4 that are that size. And so I'm going to do a second piece, and why I want to look at this is because I don't think you can add enough extra embellishments to make clusters. And the other thing I like to do is kind of balance it. So let me get this envelope out of the way. But when I look at this card, and if I were to just put a couple around this tree, visually I'm seeing something that tilts that way because there's a lot of weight over here. And by just tossing this one sequin over in this corner, it kind of sets itself straight again. Anyway, maybe it's just me. So I will leave photos of that. But let's take a look at where we are on these other cards. And so this is how this piece turned out. And all the dies I've used for this piece are all from China that I buy via eBay. But then all this card is actually scrap card for base cards that I use. So I use a lot of whites for my base cards. Of course, I cut out 3 trees, so again, this is really nice. I really wouldn't have to cluster this up at all, but I would add some life to it. So whether I put birds over here, or maybe just a couple V's and a craft color to have something flying to make this look alive. But we're going to cluster up. And so what I've done is I've cut a craft deer, and this is the way it turned out. That came from this ornament die. And so I had to do a little fussy cutting, and he looks a little pigeon-toed here, and I didn't do a great job on the hind legs. And so what I did was I did a couple more die cuts, just kind of double layered onto the pearlescent, and then I've got the craft in the back. So we're going to just cluster up with some die cuts. I do want to add a couple of 3-dimensional embellishments, so I've got some pearls here from Hobby House. So I'm going to finish that up, take photos, and we'll take a look at that piece. You know what? Also, I might throw in some birds. So I've got a couple bird dies that I might tuck into the trees. So it depends on, this guy might be the right size. And so lastly, that's a hunky-dory die. But just looking for a little more life on this card. As I said, really pretty card, just as it is almost. Lastly, I've got that topper. So this comes from Kanban Monochrome Christmas, and you see where I've already added dazzles. So just kind of stack those guys back together. I did use red and black mats. This one's actually inset into the base panel, which is made up of these 2 pieces. And so I rooted around, and I found several dazzles that will work. So I'll either be introducing some holly, but I'll be sure putting some dazzles on my Christmas tree. And then I found some black and red gifts. And it was sticking, of course, I've got gold on some of these pieces, so I want to stick with a gold outline for this. And I'll finish up with that. So I will take photos. Actually, I'll be back with these 2 finished pieces, and then we'll talk about the next section. This is how the second piece finished out, and so pretty much did everything I said I was going to do. Those pearls are just perfect in the different colors of the craft, and also the pearlescent that goes with some of this cardstock. So again, I did add the birds, and notice that this cluster really takes up about half of this card. Between the trees and the branches and the deer, I've got a lot going on, but that's okay with a cluster. So don't be afraid to kind of extend your imagery. And then on the inside, just kind of the same stuff. So I had some leftover snowflakes from that ornament die, and then an extra branch, an extra tree, and my sentiment. Of course, I'm going to do the envelope as well. So, really nice piece. And then on this one, again, don't be afraid to extend. And so I used 3 gifts here, and I backed it on red, and I backed them on black, and then some bows to kind of extend this way. Added some dazzles in my tree like I talked about. And then on the inside, again, dazzles and some of that paper. So, really nice. I'm going to do the envelope as well. Okay, in the next segment, I want to switch the icon for Christmas. I want to go with ornaments, and I could just do all the same, but I want to switch styles. So I got this really busy paper that kind of makes my cluster all by itself. I've got a stencil here, and then I kind of like the whole ornament and swirl thing, so I've got this cutting die that will cut into my cardstock, and I've already kind of prepped that piece to go this way. So it's going to be like that, and then I've got that whole interior that's showing up silver. So let me leave finished pieces of that. I'm going to start setting up some of this, and I'll be back. For the first of these ornament pieces, the first thing I want to decide, because this is a pattern paper, is what piece I want featured on my card front. And so I kind of trimmed off a couple edges, and so I decided on this section. And now I want to raise up some elements to create my cluster. And so I've got ornament keepsakes from Stampin' Up! With the coordinating holiday ornaments framelits. And so I have stamped and cut a couple of those. Actually, I took one of the ornaments out of here that I can layer up higher. And so that's going to kind of create my cluster. Now I want this to be cohesive, and so I'm thinking what I want to do is follow along some swirls with some Nuvo drops. Notice also I've stamped here because paper and stamping works really well together to make my cluster. So that's the first piece. The second one, where I'm going with this is, so I had the stencil. Let me move some of this out of the way. So where I'm at with the stencil piece is, first off, I needed a pattern that would kind of go with this whole mixed media deal. And so I used some shaving cream and inks and some embossing powders. And then I created a mask. I've got an inset die that kind of cuts these star clusters, and so I used embossing paste to put there. And then lastly, I used that same stamp set from Stampin' Up! To create some white embossed images here. I've got a sentiment over here. So this doesn't really need a bunch of additions to finish off my cluster. So I'm going to have just one ornament that's going to be hanging. And since I'm doing mixed media, I've got a ribbon that I've inked using the same turquoise kind of color that's going to hang from here and finish off this card piece. So that's going to be really nice. And then the last piece that I'm working with ornaments, also kind of got that backdrop almost completely filled out. I found a sentiment that would work with some holly leaves. Let me see if you can see that. Okay. So this cuts into the die. This one is on top. And then I'm just going to go with one humongous ornament. And then to make this one feel at home, I think I'm going to use some gems. So I'm going to add some gems to kind of cluster up here. And then we're going to see how that one turns out. So I'm going to finish off these cards. But notice also that I'm starting in these cases with the base. So kind of the basic cluster on the base card, as opposed to the first piece, or the first couple of pieces, which I started with the focal points. So anyway, let me finish up and I'll be back. I'm back with my finished projects, and they are wonderful, if I don't mind saying so myself. So I did cluster these up on that backdrop, and I did add the Nuvo drops. And I decided to go ahead and add some Nuvo drops here again because I'm talking about weight. And I keep talking about comfort, and comfort is what goes with what. And stamping and this sort of paper backdrop, I chose to go ahead and add 3 bows. We haven't talked about odd numbers, but I'm going to do that more later on in the video. But I did them in twine because that's comfortable with paper and Nuvo drops. So, it looks really good. And on the inside, just used another panel, added some Nuvo drops. That's one of the few kind of multimedia things that I will put on the inside of my card because it won't transfer to this inside panel. Anyway, finish that up. I'm going to do an envelope. As long as I've got some of that paper, I'm going to do the flap in the same color. Now the second piece. So, I've got a couple of additions on top of what I talked about before because I added this silver, and I decided that, you know what, I need a couple more silver. So I took some of those innies, a couple more of the white innies, and just kind of spread them out. And that's the way that piece turned out. And so on the inside, since I did stenciling and I've got inks here, what I'm going to do on the inside is go ahead and hang one more ornament. And I haven't talked about positioning much. And again, I'm going to kind of wait. And this is how the last piece turned out. I'm making sure you can see this. This one's a little bit more shiny. And hopefully I've still got your attention. And you're going to say, well, Calhoun, that is not a cluster. And I agree. And I think it's because these gemstones that I've added here are not enough either size or just not enough impact to make this a cluster. So you know what? I made another piece. And I could have changed this by adding maybe some tail ornaments here, but I just decided to go large. Let's look at the inside of this piece. So I added a dazzle and just another one of these die cuts here. So I went larger, and let me make sure you can see this. So I went with an 8x8. I don't make many of these, but I think this will be my mother's Christmas card. And I increased, well, first off, I've got 3 focal points. So I've got 3 die cuts that are the focal points. Remember that deer ornament? It's here, and it's backed on a silver textured paper. This one, I wanted to make sure that any swirls were showing, so back it on vellum. I don't think we think about using vellum much, but it's a great way to create your image, have it show up, but still see what's going on in the background. And then instead of gemstones, my cluster elements or the companions are these great sequins. So I did those in silver and red. But that's a really nice, great backdrop, and then just hung an ornament on the inside. So anyway, I'm going to leave photos of all this. And in the next section, well, first off, I'm going to bring back these 6 pieces because these are enough to get you going. And I'm just going to do variations using different Christmas icons. So let me photos, and I'll be back. I just wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about feeling at home and comfortable on your card front. And for that, I'm talking about cohesiveness. And so adding elements or these little doodads that kind of go with your cluster or make your cluster, like I said, feel at home or comfortable on your card front. And so here I've got a lot of metallics. I've got a coated cardstock, and I've got a glitter ribbon, and so sequins work with that. In this piece, this is another coated cardstock piece. So my topper is coated, the back panel is coated, and so I've added these red dazzles on back paper. Here, pearls, because pearls, and I've got some pearlescent here. Here I've got some silver metallics and more embossing because I've totally embossed this piece. On plain paper, Nouveau drops work well. Yeah, they're shiny, but they're not sparkly. And same with the twine ribbons. And then lastly, on this piece, I went back to sequins. So keep that in mind as I'm moving forward. Into the next section. Like I said, we're going to do some different iconic imagery. So first off, these are all going to be finished pieces because I use kind of the same elements, and you can recognize the backdrop. So I've got a strip border. This is similar to my punch, only I've used die cuts. Well, the first thing I hope you notice is I don't have a busy panel on this piece. I've got kind of the plainish patterns. This is a paper pack from Paper Wishes, and I used the busier elements to create my poinsettias. And I was talking about cohesiveness. Well, I used centers here in dazzles, and so I can add my sentiment because it kind of flows across here. As far as additional elements, I just chose to add a couple more die cuts as poinsettia leaves, finish it off on the inside with some plain paper. Excuse me. I want to talk about positioning a little bit because the first pieces were all Christmas trees, so they were all kind of grounded. My second pieces were all ornaments, and so they were kind of hanging from the top. In this case, poinsettias I could put anywhere. So I could cluster them into a corner, either top or bottom, or centered, as in this case. Now, my second piece, I'm going to use another piece of that panel, and I'm going to emboss, dry emboss it. So I've got this embossing folder. Let me put a backing behind it. This is from Stamping Up, where I've already got my corner. So this is another one where I'm kind of starting with the backdrop on my shaving cream panel. And I kind of looked around for some shaving cream videos, and I just want to give you a heads up. I'm going to do some shaving cream panels and finished projects in one of my next videos. So stay tuned for that. But in this case, I inked it over. I added some heat embossed snowflakes, and the snowflake stamps are from Paper Wishes, and added Nouveau drops to this piece as well. I'm going to heat emboss here my salutation, and on the inside I just have an additional strip. And like I said, we're going to talk about shaving cream panels, and I want to do another piece of embossing. But before I do, when I emboss my card front, if it's possible, I like to emboss the envelope as well, because that kind of gives you a prelude to what's going to happen. And my next piece was kind of a last minute addition. Let me make sure you can see that, because I got a lot of new subscribers that have been buying into this whole toilet paper thing, or like the toilet paper panels. And so I created another one. This embossing folder comes from Paper Wishes. So I've got an all-over snowflake. And I did that, and I just used some embellishment mousse to kind of ink it up a little bit. Of course, I'm going to ink those frayed edges because they are the prettiest thing about toilet paper. That and peeling it back. I will tell you, in that video, I suggested that you Separate your toilet paper layers, not necessary. These were just 2-ply layers, 4 of them that I embossed. Now, I want to make this comfortable. So the first thing I did is when I mounted this, well, I chopped off this corner, and this piece is also embossed behind there. And then added my cluster of snowflakes. This is another one where I'm looking at snowflakes can go anywhere. Of course, to be comfortable, I'm going to add some sequins. I've got all kinds of foiled. I introduced my white base cardstock and kind of this sheen ribbon. I touched on ribbons and twines, but you want something that's going to be at home on your card front. Just added another snowflake on the inside. Next piece. Actually, let me separate here because what I want to talk about is dividing up your focals. And this is the piece I'm talking about because in every card design or technique, there's usually something that appeals to me only because I've got a lot of it, and that is a topper. And I know a lot of folks are afraid to cut into their single topper. So this is another way to kind of do that same sort of process as far as shapes. And so I just got this one smallish topper, and again, I've got a lot of those, but a neat way to present it on your card front is to add the same shape or repeat the shape in this kind of cluster piece. And I want to introduce this because I've cut into it again. So again, bringing back some of these techniques. These are melted Christmas backgrounds from Tattered Lace. And so you saw where I used the stars, but I've also got a snowflake die here that cuts into your cardstock. Of course, you could just repeat a smallish die cut and cut into your card base. Again, I've got the simple background. I've got scraps of paper from a magazine. And on top, I am putting sequins. And this is a laser cut paper from Crate & Craft. And so did that on the outside, on the inside. Again, I'm going to bring in the silver. As long as I've got those innies, I'm going to use them on the inside as well. So that is this piece. So smallish topper, repeating the shapes. And on that note, I've got another collection. So this is one of those collections where you've got a lot of the same thing. So you got a lot of the same thing. Why not take a couple? And here's the piece I made out of a couple of those toppers. Again, repeating the shape across. And so I did use a couple. And first off, I'm going to do is try and find places in this that I can use in my backdrop. So I've got these kind of landscape ovals. Again, I'm adding sequins. I'm kind of repeating the fact that I've got this ribbon strip across here. I've got them backed. I've got them layered on top of each other. And I added everything on this guy. So I've got my sequins. I've got pearls. I've got Nouveau drops. And that's how this piece turned out. And then the last piece I want to show you. Well, actually, let me leave photos of that because the last piece has to do with scrapbooking. And so I'm going to bring in that scrapbook page because what you can do on a card, you can do on a page. Okay, so scrapbook pages. Well, the first thing I want you to notice is that on this page, well, first, the backdrop. And so I've got my split backdrop. So panel here, I've got my ribbon strip, and then another pattern down here. But in the cluster, really all I've got here are 2 photos. So I've got me with all my mama stockings, and then I've got kind of a close-up, which I divided in the same way I divided my Christmas tree topper, because that works on a scrapbook page as well. So I've got a couple of these underneath, and I've got this one raised up. And I want to do something with buttons, so this one I added some buttons, because it's about sewing and sequins and buttons and stitching. And I've got pattern papers to make up the rest of my squares, like I did in my snowman. And then lastly, the other scatter element I have are these kind of 3-dimensional bows. This is a die cut from eBay, a 2-piece bow die, and that's the way this all worked out. Of course, on a scrapbook page, you always have a companion. And so I've done the same thing on, actually this is the primary page, but I've got my daughter's scrapbooking here, and so what I've got are little book pages, but everything is circles. So you can choose, again, whatever shape you want. I'm going to kind of repeat the whole button thing going on and the bows, borders, and different patterns because this is the companion page. So I'll leave photos of that, but what I want you to notice in just this last little thing is scale. So I've kind of got this cluster coming across the top. Again, I'm going to kind of balance it with down here. I've got an 8x8, larger die cuts. I've got this little guy here with little smaller squares and some smaller papers, and then my medium-sized cards. So anyway, I've got a little preview of what's coming up next, but I thank you for watching.